Hello, hello. This is Alan Davidson, and welcome. This is the Tapping Liberation Home Study course. This is module number 6, the emotional brilliance process, and also the introduction to grief, which is the toxic emotion that is often stored in the throat chakra. So as you can see, the throat chakra is blue. Grief is the corrosive emotion that is stored and trapped not only in the connective tissues of the body, the bones, the muscles, but also in that throat chakra and our energy grid. And when we're able to actually release the grief that's held here, the state of being, that deep emotion, is one of deep joy. And in the spectrum of toning that I use to work with the 7 chakras, the vowel sound here at the throat is O, as in open. So if you're toning here in the throat chakra, you can tone with O. So I wanted to start with sharing with you that I know a lot about grief in my personal experience and also in my studies and life's work. Many of you know that I moved to Houston in 1980 to become bartender to the Fabulous. And I bartended for 10 years at least. Actually 12 years, a dozen years. And I was also an IV drug user. And partied hard. He saw a lot of flashing highs and crashing lows, and eventually did get sober and found my way to the 12-step program and got clean and sober initially in 1988, and was sober for a little over 2 years, 2.5 years, and had a short relapse that involved a trip to New Orleans and Mardi Gras. But I came home from Mardi Gras in like March 1st of 1990 and went pretty much to a 12-step Alcoholics Anonymous meeting the next day, and I have been sober ever since. So going on, 23 plus years now. But as I said, I got sober, clean and sober in 1988. Which for me was the point when AIDS was just starting to really hit my inner circle of friends. There were about 50 of us that sort of traveled in a large pack, and we went to the clubs, we went dancing, we went to movies and concerts and architectural openings and art openings, and we just traveled in a large pack, and anything that was fun and fabulous and exciting, we were generally there. But by the time AIDS had really taken its toll on us, that group of 50 has now at this point dwindled to there are 5 of us that are left. 3 of us are HIV negative and 2 of us are HIV positive and living with the long-term effects of AIDS. One, Dr. Wayne, is still actually working and healthy and happy, and Uncle Harry is on long-term disability but works part-time at an art gallery in New Orleans. So people talk about decimation and communities being decimated. In the World War II, they talked about Stalingrad, the population of Stalingrad being decimated by the German attack there. That means that 10% of the population was killed or annihilated. We'll look at the percentages of AIDS in my life and my community. There were periods every week when I was, every weekend there would be at least one memorial service of someone who had passed away. Think about my group of 50 friends, and there's 5 of us left. That means 90% of my inner core circle of people died. So it's a tremendous amount of grief that happened. Not only in the inner circle of that pack of people, that tribe, people that I used to run with, but then coworkers, clients and customers, associates, people I volunteered with. When I first started my massage practice, a lot of my emphasis was working with the HIV/AIDS community. I was, there was a body positive group here looking at alternative ways to support HIV and AIDS. And I was one of the co-leaders with Dr. Wayne of the very first support group that Body Positive offered. So very much involved with, engaged with, trying to help come to some sort of psychological and emotional and spiritual understanding of AIDS and the AIDS epidemic, and completely surrounded by death and dying, which would have a great impact on me. And sometimes I was not always the best friend. The loss, the overwhelming loss, the constant losing of dear friends. Sometimes I was an absentee friend. I just couldn't handle the loss and the grief and the pain of so much death. So I've spent a lot of time atoning for that in some way. And so much so that when I finally did get back to school and take advantage of the gifts that I've been given and finally graduated with my bachelor's in science, most of my hours were in psychology and sociology, and I've actually had 2 college courses on grief and dying. But the most important thing that helped me really was this little book, the Grief Recovery Handbook. I have told the story before about my psychotherapist and one of my spiritual teachers, Miles Glaspie, and I had one-on-one therapy with him, but also he had a weekly meditation group that met for many, many years, and I was one of the core group that stayed for a very, very long time. And for those of you that know JD, who works with me in my office, he was part of that meditation group. And at a certain point, Miles took us through the process in this Grief Recovery Handbook, which is a beautiful way of coming to terms with very specific, unique griefs in our lives. And from that experience, then I started facilitating groups of my friends who had lost so many people and helping us come to terms with the incredible ache in our hearts from all this grief. And I love this quote: "Grief is like an ocean. It comes on waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm, and sometimes it is overwhelming. And all we can do is to learn to swim." Because the reality is that we are surrounded by grief all the time. That's just the nature of life. There's always something rising and something falling away. And we have to learn to deal with that. So let's just define what is grief. It is the normal and natural reaction to loss of any kind. Grief is the conflicting feeling caused by the end or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. It is the sadness, the grieving that happens when any major shift in our lives happens. And as you'll see, that can be a whole spectrum from death and divorce, to even positive things like getting a promotion or graduating from school. When a goal, a particular golden goal, something we've really coveted and longed for a long time, has finally been achieved. It can actually be a quality of sadness and grief because something that we've striven for and driven for so long has been accomplished. And so it sort of leaves a hole or a vacancy or grief in us. Fear is that feeling of as I often talk about, each of the toxic emotions in the 5 lower chakras, fear is the underlying emotion of that major feeling. And in the throat, the grief that we feel is that we've had a sense of longing or connection or belonging that has been very important to us and sustained us and nurtured us in very important ways. And so part of the grieving process is that we fear that we've lost something that will never be recreated again, that will never have that kind of a connection again, which is a truth. we have the opportunity for other connections that will be just as important and just as satisfying and nurturing and healing for us, but we will never be able to create what was lost with a particular person, place, or circumstance in our life. And also one of the things, particularly in American culture and in Western culture, grief is the most neglected and misunderstood experience in the Western world. It is, we're not great in the United States of feeling our feelings and our emotions, particularly our intense emotions. And I want you to think of some of the most common phrases that you hear at funerals or that you hear shared with people. And it's this idea that, oh, they're in a better place, or they lived a really good and satisfying life. Or, don't feel so bad. They've gone on to their destiny with the Lord, or they're in heaven now. And in the phrasing of that, there is the inherent statement, don't feel your grief. Don't own the deep sadness and emotion that you feel of loss right now. That you, that the person is a better place and you shouldn't feel so bad. Feel better knowing that they're in a better place. So many of the messages in our culture are, very mixed about that. I also want you to think about, when you were a kid, if you had a dog and the dog died, they would just say, oh, don't feel so bad, let's go get another dog. Or if you had a bicycle and your bicycle was stolen, it was like, well, let's go get you another bicycle. It was the idea that you can replace the loss. So instead of allowing you to really feel your grief and teaching you how to hold that space in your own body and in your own life and in your own emotional intelligence, that yes, own the grief and the sadness that you feel and, allow that to happen. So here are just some of the qualities of grief. Death, whether it's spouse, parents, family, mentors, friends, heroes, even pets. One of the great surprises for me, having lived through the AIDS epidemic and seen so many people die, that, death in a way became a friend. And I really made my peace with my own faith. I happen to believe in reincarnation. I happen to believe that, I always joke that when I die, that my friends will be waiting for me under some great dance hall in the sky with a fabulous mirror ball, and then I'll be just dancing for joy and celebrating the life and the friendship that we always had. And that's just a story that I tell. I don't quite really know or understand what will happen when I die. But after all the death of human beings that I have known, when I finally got around to actually adopting a dog I guess I was in my late 30s, and I had Whisper for 10 years just about. He was very, very old, and he went to work with me every day. And when Whisper died, it was a beautiful, beautiful transition. We were present with him. I could not believe the waves of grief that racked my heart and just tore my heart open. And it was very powerful and very beautiful and profound that a dog dying could affect me in a way that people dying hadn't. Even when my grandmother died a few years before, it hadn't touched me in quite that specific a way. So different losses affect us in different ways. Now, I just want to show you one of the things that happens when we're grieving. Now, this is a brain scan of depression. Grief is that intense emotion. It's very, very similar to depression in brain scans. And so if you look at the right-hand side, you can see that this is a brain in normal activity that's not depressed or not experiencing intense levels of grief. And you can see all the different activity that's happening. On the left-hand side, you can see a brain that is depressed, that is experiencing certain levels of grief and loss and sadness. And you can see the limited amount of brain activity that's actually happening. Our brains are not fully functioning. We don't have access to the full spectrum of emotions, and we certainly don't have access to the executive functioning of our brain, the neocortex. So when we are experiencing deep grief and sadness, that's why they say don't make major decisions about selling your house or your business or moving to another city when you're in intense grief, because you don't have access to the full functioning of your own brain. So it's better to ride out the waves of grief, be present in your body, be present to all the different emotions and the thoughts that come up, and then the trusted wisdom say 12 months later, then make a major life decision. So another function of loss is divorce, and it really is every broken romantic relationship, friendships, and family. Yes, you see many people divorce their families because they can be too toxic or painful to be around, or they've, been abusive in some way. But even, when you choose to be the person who's doing the divorcing, there's still a grieving process. Even with the family that you're divorcing, there is the loss of what could have been. There's the loss of what was, and there's also the loss of the dream, what could have been. So there's multi-levels of grieving that happens in these major life transitions. One of the things that I hear a lot about in my coaching work and my individual and group work is that people evolve and grow spiritually and emotionally, and they start to really move and embody the maturity and the spiritual enlightenment that they've worked towards. There's always this sense of I'm outgrowing my friends, or I'm outgrowing these people that used to mean so much to me, and they're just not very interesting anymore. And so there's also a grieving of who we were and who those relationships were in our life. Another sense of loss is innocence, trust, prestige, goals, as I mentioned earlier, moving from homes or neighborhoods, or even like the empty nest. So there is a sense that there are different aspects that happen. Friendships that are broken, trust that's violated. There's a grieving process there. Prestige, a certain sense of reputation that we had that somehow becomes tarnished by something we did or didn't do. Moving from a childhood home or a neighborhood, or a sense, how we associate a sense of ourself with a place, and that changes. And so there's a facet of ourselves that we're grieving that seems to be lost. And then empty nest, we hear a lot about that these days. It's as much as the intimate relationship that parents have with their children, and then they go off to college, and all of a sudden they're not around all the time, and or they're not available for those spontaneous conversations. So there's the grieving of how the relationship has changed, but also as our role as a good mother or a good father is changing. We're losing that part, that facet of ourselves that's been so engaged for 18 plus years that all of a sudden is having to change and transform. So there's a sense of losing a part of ourselves. So it's a double whammy there with the empty nest. And then I mentioned, achieving certain goals, graduating from school, achieving a cherished goal, getting a dream job, actually getting married, is a sense of, when we choose to go into a relationship, the person that we were as a single individual, the life that we led before we met our spouse and partner, that phase of our life is ending. Who we were is changing, and so there is a grieving process that also happens. Even giving birth to a child, the postpartum depression, there's a physiological aspect of that, but then there's also the emotional, psychological aspect of that. Like who we were before is changing. Sobriety, we can the addiction that we might have indulged in. That when we get sober, we're leaving a lifestyle and a way of being and a part of ourselves behind, and we're often painfully and slowly creating a new sense of self. And there is a grieving that happens for that easier, softer way when we could just go out and, have a cocktail or buy some street drugs or prescription drugs, or we could indulge in some behavior that we ultimately pay too high a price for. So again, there's this grieving quality even as we're moving towards a newer and healthier way of being in the world. And then ultimately, like retirement, health problems, legal problems, there's that. Again, health problems, it's like not only do we have to deal with the reality of some chronic disease, it could be a life-threatening disease like heart attack or cancer or something. And we have to grieve who we were in our youth and having a body that really functioned and did what we wanted to. As we grow older in our bodies, our skin is not as smooth, our reflexes are not as sharp, our ability to heal from injuries is not as fast. When we retire, there's a sense of, who we had been as a working individual and contributing to society and making money, and who we so often were associated so much with our jobs and our careers and who we have been as some successful level at our work. So again, there's a grieving that happens at all these levels. You can see grief is something that is always happening through the life process. And then I want to get to the esoteric level. One of the great losses that happens at a sub-energetic level, I always talk about, when we're born, the first initial sacred wound is the sense of, I am separate from, cosmic reality. I am separate from the great spirit that exists. That's just the dynamic and the way humanity is set up to function and to live. And so there is a great loss. There is a grieving that the soul feels, or aspects of the spirit feels, because of that disconnection. It's longing for the freedom. When we come into three-dimensional time and space in a baby's body, there's a sense of sort of maybe being trapped and not understanding, and things move a lot more slowly and are more difficult than we ever imagined as a free spirit at the ethereal level. So there's a part where that soul longs for its freedom of non-dimensional time and space, transcending time and space. It wants that freedom. And that's part of what drives our own spiritual development and spiritual evolution, is that longing to go back to the source. So that also is stored at the throat chakra. And I just want you to think about the 7 chakras. The lower 5 are the elements of creation. The root chakra is earth. The second chakra is water. The third chakra is fire. The heart chakra is air, and the throat chakra is ether. And those are the 5 elements of creation that are needed to manifest reality. And so the 6th and 7th chakra are still connected at the etheric, spiritual level. They transcend time and space in the 5 elements. So there's still that element of freedom. That's why the corrosive and toxic emotions are not effective at the higher levels. They're only effective in the 5 layers of creation and in reality, 3-dimensional time and space. So as the soul incarnates and comes through the crown chakra and the third eye chakra, it's when the soul reaches the throat that it really enters in 3-dimensional time and space at the etheric level, and then moves to the full embodiment at the bones and the muscles and connective tissues at the root chakra in the body. So that's where the grief is held in the throat, which is also part of the longing for the soul. So there's that grief that's also happening at the same time. So as you begin to work through all the different griefs in your life, from, having a bicycle stolen, or your first pet dying, or one of your grandparents or parents dying or divorcing, and you look at that spectrum of all the different griefs that you've encountered and experienced, all of those are stored in the throat, imprinted in the throat. So it's very important to work powerfully in the throat chakra, particularly for those of you that feel like you are a leader, you're a charismatic leader of some kind, and that you have a mission and a message to share with the world. It's so important to really work and clear all of these chakras, but very specifically with the throat chakra, where you are using your voice, your speeches, your talks, and your teaching to share that message and impact the ripples of community that go out into the world. Okay, so here are some of the painful emotions that are held at the throat chakra: sadness, disappointment, pain, mourning, grief, depression, desolation, distraught, despair, misery, woe, hurt, pain, anguish, and agony. That spectrum of pain that's held there in the throat. And for those of you that have experienced the loss of a loved, whether it's death or divorce, you know how agonizing it can really be, and how frightening it can be, and how painful it can be. So if we are not present to those emotions, then they get stored, they get trapped in the energetic field. They get trapped in the chakras and the layers of the auric field, and they also get stored in every layer of consciousness, but particularly the bones and muscles. And that's why, like during a Rolfing session, the deep, deep tissue body work, the structural realignment, where they're working so deeply into the deepest layers of muscle and connective tissue and working with those dark crevices of the body that rarely feel another human presence or intention or touch, that so many of these memories that are stored can come up and out and be processed. So once again, working through these emotions and using the emotional brilliance healing process will bring you to a place of deep joy. And that's what's left when you really begin to work and clear out these griefs, these old griefs that are stored there. And particularly when we get to the fifth chakra, as you've been clearing and working the lower chakras, I talk a lot about temporary states into permanent traits. In this voice dialogue process that we do, of moving from the voices of the ego and the personality, the little self, into the voices of the enlightened self, the non-self. There are flashes, and people have a wonderful experience, and sometimes it only lasts as long as a facilitation or as long as a meditation. So how do we move from making those temporary traits to permanent states? And it really is moving from, being able to fully embody these beautiful states of being for longer and longer periods of time until they just become our center of gravity. It's who we are. It's who we live our life from. And these other aspects of consciousness have been matured and evolved and nurtured and embraced and really integrated into who we are. So this really brings us to the process now where you're ready to begin to work with the emotional brilliance process. Here is the form where you can print it out here from the PDF, which you see below. You'll also see the link just to directly print it out by yourself, and then watch the emotional brilliance process that I do for grief. It just seems to be perfect. A little aside story, the person that we were going to work with, Nan, who is the echo, the person who does the demonstration with me here, we were really going to work on the second chakra, on longing and lust and cravings in the second chakra. And we were all set to go, and, we'd had a great conversation, and I simply couldn't get the technology to work, and we mussed around with it for almost an hour and could not quite get it to work on her end and my end, and there were just issues after issues. And finally, she had another appointment, and we didn't have the time that we needed to really do the process and give it justice. And so I said, okay, let's stop, let's table this, and we'll do it later next week. And we set a time, and I got really clear in one of my meditations that the process we needed to focus on for Nan actually was grief. And it turned out that she had a daughter who had died 16, 18 years ago now, and she was still holding a lot of grief about that. And so you'll find in her demonstration that it was absolutely extraordinary. You'll also see that Nan is a change agent. She is a charismatic leader. She does have a very important grand vision for her life, a mission, and an important message that she wants to share. And she's very much into public speaking. And you'll notice that towards the end we do an extraordinary process about the blue sapphire light in the throat chakra that really helps to clear out that last little residue that she was holding. And again, the beauty of doing EFT tapping is the shared benefits. Even though we're focusing on Nan's story, if you tap, you'll find that, any resistance that you had, any intensity and trauma that you felt around your own story as we regress back to the earliest safe and appropriate memory, that 9 times out of 10 is completely released and neutralized for you too. So that's the promise and possibility of this work. So that's it. That's our introduction to grief and the toxic emotions that are stored in the throat chakra, and then prepping you for the emotional brilliance healing process. So you're ready to go on to the next stage. Thank you for your attention, and we'll talk.